They told Elena Ward he was dead. They locked her away for loving the enemy. But on a stormy desert night, she tore the chains from her soul and ran barefoot through the darkness to the place they once called theirs. There, beneath the charred stump of a burned tree, Kai Tahoma stood, wounded, alive, and still carrying the promise they made under moonlight and gunfire. "I waited for you," he whispered, voice ragged like the wind. She touched the scar on his shoulder and breathed, "Then we run, or we burn together." Before dawn, they would have to choose: stay hidden and watch love die in silence, or stand together and risk everything for a freedom they might never taste again. They called Fort Claiborne an iron gate on the edge of the Arizona frontier, a patchwork of palisades, cannons, and blue wool uniforms meant to keep the savages out and the settlers safe within. But even the strongest walls can't hold back a heartbeat or chain down the wild wind that carries a secret name at dusk. Elena Ward was 18 when she first stepped beyond those gates alone. The fort was her father's pride, Colonel Silas Ward, a man with medals on his chest and salt in his veins. But to her, it was a cage lined with bayonets. They said a frontier girl's duty was to keep her hands folded and her eyes lowered, to wait for a husband in uniform and bear sons to carry a rifle someday. Elena wanted none of it. The first night she slipped past the picket line, her boots sank into the soft red dust behind the stables. Her heart beat so loud she was sure the sentries could hear it. But beyond the last lantern's reach, the desert breathed her name like a promise. And there, waiting in the shadow of the cottonwoods, was Kai Tahoma, the captured Apache marksman who'd once been the fort's enemy, and now its silent prisoner. Kai's hands were bound in chains during the day, forced to cut wood or dig trenches for the very soldiers who had raided his village. But at night sometimes he found his freedom where the soldiers' eyes turned blind. And sometimes he shared that freedom with Elena. That particular night, the moon was thin as a blade. "You move too loud," Kai murmured as she stumbled over a half-buried stone. His voice was rough from days of forced silence, but softened when he looked at her. "The desert knows you don't belong." "Then teach me," Elena whispered. She knelt beside him where the dirt turned soft under a mesquite tree. He pressed his palm to the ground, showing her the faint indent of a coyote's paw. How the claw marks curved, how the weight told of a limp. He traced the wind's path with a flick of his wrist, teaching her to smell sage before the breeze shifted, to listen for owl wings above her head. For an hour they spoke in the hush between heartbeat and breath. His fingers brushed hers as he pointed out rabbit trails, broken branches, a strand of horsehair snagged on thorn. In those moments, she didn't see the man her father called the enemy. She saw the life they could have had in a place with no walls, a tiny fire under the stars. Two people reading the earth instead of lines on a map drawn by men in Washington. Back in the fort, no one spoke of the girls who broke the rules. But they existed. Daughters of colonels and blacksmiths alike, who fell for men wearing the wrong color of skin or cloth. Some were banished east, locked in convents to scrub their shame away in cold stone chapels. Others vanished in the dark, following warriors into canyons the army couldn't tame. In her private moments, Elena wondered if she was foolish, or simply awake. Loving Kai was betrayal, they said. Treason. But what do you call it when the war sits at your supper table? When the enemy isn't on the other side of the fort's guns but across from you, holding your hand in the dark? Maybe betrayal is just another word for freedom. Maybe the only way to break the iron gates was to slip through them with your heart wide open. To see a man not as an enemy, not as a savage, but as someone who taught you to listen to the land and believe that fences were not meant for souls like yours. When they parted that night, Kai pressed a small carved bead into her palm. "So you remember what I see," he said. Elena closed her fingers around it, holding it close as she crept back through the shadows, back into the fort that could never hold her love captive for long. The juniper tree stood on the far edge of the ridgeline, its branches crooked like an old man's fingers, clutching at the desert sky. In the day, it offered little shade, but at night, when the world turned silver and still, it became a cathedral for secrets that had no place behind the fort's walls. Elena first brought Kai Tahoma there when the moon was heavy and the air smelled of creosote. She told him the story her mother once whispered. That the villagers believed the tree had been planted by a runaway settler woman and a Comanche hunter nearly 50 years ago. They say she was the daughter of a preacher who promised her hand to a cavalryman, but her heart betrayed her. She met the hunter on the riverbank, taught him her language while he taught her how to snare fish and read the wind. When the town found out, they planned to drag her back and hang him for theft of a white girl's virtue. So instead, they slipped away under the same moon that now shone over Elena and Kai. In the soft cradle of the canyon, they planted a juniper seedling at the base of a stone ridge, a living marker of a vow made in blood and kisses. Some say the lovers vanished into the mountains. Others claim their bones lie tangled beneath the roots, feeding the tree that never stopped growing. For decades, soldiers and settlers alike whispered that the juniper had magic in its bark, that if an outcast bled on its roots, the tree would drink their pain and keep them alive through the cruelties of the desert sun. Elena didn't know if she believed that, but standing there with Kai's hand warm in hers, she wanted to. The promise box they hid beneath its gnarled roots was small enough to fit in a palm. Kai carved the eagle with a stolen knife during the nights when the guards dozed by the whiskey barrels. Each wing feather was rough but certain, each line a prayer that the world's fences could not keep two hearts caged forever. Inside, Elena tucked a strip of blue cotton torn from the hem of her dress, the same dress her father insisted she wear to Sunday gatherings as proof of her virtue. Kai added a lock of his hair, bound with a single red bead from his mother's wedding band. They pressed the lid closed and buried it in the dirt as the wind spun dust devils across the plain. To anyone else, it was just a trinket, a box without worth, hidden where rattlesnakes made their beds. But to them, it was a bond stronger than any iron gate, a promise that love, once given freely, could outlive exile, bullets, and betrayal. Long after, Elena would learn that such keepsakes were not so rare. She'd hear whispers of Lakota brides weaving their lovers' hair into beaded moccasins, Cherokee girls braiding silver coins into their sashes so they'd have a piece of home even when taken west. And on the frontier's edges, women who loved across enemy lines stitched scraps of their lovers' shirts inside their bonnets, a hidden vow carried beneath the sunbonnets and prairie winds. What was it about love that made people risk everything for a scrap of cloth or a strand of hair? Maybe it was the knowledge that when history forgets your name, a keepsake buried under a sacred tree might remember it for you. Maybe it was defiance, proof that the heart doesn't bend to walls drawn on a map or to a father's rage. On the nights when the fort's search lamps swept across the ridge, Elena and Kai would crouch beneath the juniper's branches. They'd feel the rough bark press into their spines, the earth cool and dry beneath their palms. Above them, the eagle box slept in its secret grave, cradling the pieces of themselves they could not show the world. It was more than wood, more than cloth and hair. It was a quiet rebellion, a seed planted deep in the soil, waiting for a day when even if they burned, even if they fell, something stronger than their fear would rise up green and stubborn from the dust. The walls of the Santa Catalina convent were thick enough to hush any confession, yet thin enough to let the wind slip through the cracks at night, carrying whispers that would not die. They told Elena Ward that these walls would cleanse her, strip away the stain of her forbidden love, and restore her father's name among the officers who spat her story like poison around campfires. It took 3 days to get her there in a rattling wagon, wrists bound in rawhide cords that bit deep into her skin. The sisters did not chain her once she passed through the carved oak doors. They didn't have to. The convent's stone corridors were prison enough, each echoing footstep a reminder that the only voices allowed here were the ones that prayed, not the ones that remembered. The room they gave her was a cell in all but name, a straw mattress, a chipped clay pitcher, a wooden cross above the bed. That was her world. But hidden beneath the straw, wrapped in a scrap of Kai's old buckskin, Elena kept a slip of blue cotton and a few dark strands of his hair. She would lie awake at night, fingertips brushing that secret relic like the pulse of a life she refused to surrender. The days bled into each other. Dawn bells, cold wash basins, breakfast in silence, chores, psalms, the dry rasp of the rosary beads slipping through her calloused fingers. and always Sister Agnes standing behind her, eyes sharp as the iron keys at her waist. "You will thank your father for saving you," the old nun would hiss when Elena lingered too long by the garden gate. "Better a life behind walls than in sin with a savage." But at night the walls did not hold her secrets so tight. Elena began to write letters. Not only to Kai, though she tried. She wrote in scraps, the backs of hymn sheets, torn corners of confession notes, the frayed edges of old laundry lists. She wrote her memories of the ridge where the juniper tree still grew, wild and defiant. She wrote how Kai had taught her to listen to the wind's true voice. She wrote her fear that the promise box they buried was now alone, cradling their love under sun-cracked dirt while she shriveled behind adobe and stone. What the sisters didn't see was that her words reached farther than they knew. She hid the scraps in unexpected places. A hymn book's spine, the hem of an altar cloth, a wicker basket stacked with fresh bread for the village orphans. Some vanished, carried away by chance or God's own hand. Others found eyes brave enough to read them. One day a novice named Sister Lilia found one of Elena's hidden scraps while folding the altar linens. Lilia was young, with trembling hands and a softness in her gaze that the convent had not yet hardened. That night, while the rest knelt in the chapel, Lilia slipped into Elena's cell and pressed a tiny note into her palm. "He's not dead," it read in a wobbly hand. "A peddler said an Apache with a limp crossed the border at La Rinconada. I will try to send word." It was not much, but it kept the flame alive. For weeks after, Elena traced those words under her blanket, mouthing them like a prayer, stronger than any Latin chant the sisters forced her to recite. But the letter never reached Kai. Somewhere between the convent and the dry gullies of New Mexico, hope got swallowed by dust and silence. There was a cruelty in that, but a strange mercy too, because hope, once planted, has a way of cracking stone. Years later, historians would write about how frontier families used boarding schools and convents to cleanse the half-breeds, to cut away any seed of loyalty that strayed across racial lines. They spoke of girls sent east with new names, boys stripped of braids and words their mothers sang into their ears by firelight. The story of Elena and Kai was one among thousands that might have been lost. Another name struck from a ledger, another ghost to be buried under the stone floor of some mission church. But there were always those who fought silence with scraps of paper, a braid of hair tucked into a pocket, a bead sewn into the hem of a shift. A story passed mouth to ear, mother to daughter, like an ember hidden in dry grass. Elena's hidden letters were her rebellion. She may have been locked behind convent walls, but every word she wrote was a knock at the door, a reminder that somewhere out there, a man named Kai Tahoma still carried the promise they made under the juniper tree. In the convent's hush, where the devil wore a crucifix and salvation smelled of candle smoke, Elena learned one truth they could never whip out of her. Words once freed could slip through any keyhole, and love once spoken could survive any locked door. No one knew the exact moment when the rumor first slipped through the trading posts and cattle pens like a half-remembered prayer, that a wounded Apache marksman, thought dead in the ambush at Silver Bend, had been seen limping through the arroyos of New Mexico. Most dismissed it as frontier gossip. Ghost stories for wagoneers who liked their whiskey strong and their fires bright enough to scare off regret. But rumors, like seeds, know how to find the cracks. Kai Tahoma did not feel alive the first weeks after the bullet tore through his shoulder and left him for dead beneath the scorched cottonwoods. He lay half buried in his own blood, drifting in and out of a fever that burned like a sun inside his bones. He might have died there if not for Chayton, the old healer who found him at dawn while following a trail of vultures. Chayton was a man the soldiers called a witch, and the old women called a ghost, too stubborn to die, too wise to stay. He had buried 2 wives, 3 sons, and a whole way of life before he ever laid eyes on Kai. But something in the younger man's face, the raw refusal to let go, reminded him of his own lost boy, Tahali. Under the shade of a makeshift lean-to, Chayton ground desert herbs and sang to the wind. He burned sage to drive away the rot from Kai's shoulder. At night, when Kai drifted toward the place between worlds, Chayton would press a warm hand to his chest and whisper, "Stay. Not yet. Not for you." When the fever finally broke, Kai woke to the sound of the old man sharpening a bone needle, ready to stitch the wound the white man's bullet had left behind. One night, as Kai sat propped against a flat rock, Chaitin laid out a string of carved beads, each one a small prayer. He told Kai the story of Dahali, the sharpest shot in their band, who once split a hawk's wing mid-flight with a single arrow. "He died so you could crawl out of that ravine," Chaitin rasped, eyes cloudy but burning. "He saw your promise, the one you buried under that juniper tree. He knew it was worth more than his own life." Kai closed his eyes then, the weight of Tahali's sacrifice pressing on him like the desert sky at noon. He thought of Elena's voice, the way she had whispered, "I believe you," when everyone else saw only a savage. He thought of the box with the carved eagle, the blue cloth, the lock of hair, a promise the world would rather see forgotten. When the snowmelt came, Chaitin helped Kai bind his shoulder tight and pointed him toward the trail that would skirt the military patrols. "Go," the old man said, pressing a pouch of dried herbs into his palm. "Keep that promise alive. If you do not, all this dying is just dying." And so Kai Tahoma walked, not with the proud stride he once carried, but with a limp that ached with every step, each mile a ghost dragging at his heels. By the time he reached the outskirts of Santa Catalina, he was more shadow than man. But shadows know how to wait. He slept in dry riverbeds, under mesquite thickets, living on the thin meat of prairie rabbits and the stale memories of what he'd left behind. When he reached the convent's outer walls, the sun had begun to sink into a bruised sky. He watched the nuns move like pale spirits across the courtyard, white veils brushing adobe stone. His heart thundered when he saw her. Elena, thinner than he remembered, her hair tucked away, her eyes downcast. But when she paused at the old ivy-covered wall, her head tilted like a doe catching the scent of home, he knew. She hadn't forgotten. That night, the wind turned cold and heavy with the promise of rain. Elena waited until the bells called for midnight prayers, then slipped out the back gate, barefoot on the wet earth. She ran through the orchard, where the sisters grew bitter herbs to purify impure souls. She ran through the sagebrush and cactus needles that cut at her legs until the blood mixed with the rain. She ran back to the place where a promise had once been buried. Certain the wind wasn't lying this time. All that remained of the juniper tree was a blackened stump, struck by lightning the summer she was taken. It looked like an open wound against the ghostly horizon. She dropped to her knees, hands pressing into the cracked soil as if she could will the tree back to life. Then he stepped forward, Kai with his hair tied back, his coat threadbare, his left arm bound tight in a faded cloth. A limp dragged at his gait, but his eyes still knew hers. "Elena," he breathed. His voice broke around her name like a man remembering how to speak. She stumbled toward him, fingertips brushing the scar that marked where life had tried to leave him behind. "I thought you were dead." He laughed, a sound more raw than joyful. "So did I." She opened her fist, revealing a scrap of blue cloth, torn, dirty, but whole. "I kept my promise," she said, voice cracking. He reached inside his coat and pulled out the small carved box. The eagle wings weathered but unbroken. "So did I." They stood there, forehead to forehead, as the wind rose around them, carrying the scent of rain and gunpowder, and the hush of ghosts who knew what it cost to keep love alive in a land that would rather bury it. In that moment, no bullet, no wall, no father's shame could break what had already survived its own funeral. By dawn, the rain had washed the desert clean, but Kai and Elena's boots were caked in red mud when they reached the edge of Fort Claiborne. They didn't ride in secret this time. No more shadows or back trails. They came together side by side through the front gate, as if daring the walls to swallow them whole again. At first, the soldiers didn't know what to make of the sight. The fort commander's daughter, hair loose around her shoulders, and the wounded Apache marksman whose name had once been a curse whispered around the barracks fires. Rifles rose, orders barked. The flag flapped heavy in the dawn wind. Elena stood taller than she ever had behind those gates. "My name is Elena Ward," she called, voice ringing clear, "and this man is not your enemy. He is my promise." Some men spat in the dirt, some lowered their eyes, but a few, the old scout who remembered Kai dragging his wounded boy out from a canyon raid, the cook who'd heard the rumors of a promise buried under a tree, stepped forward, silent but unflinching. Even a weather-beaten sergeant tipped his hat. Sometimes it doesn't take a crowd to break a wall, just a handful of souls brave enough to stand in its breach. The fort's commander, Colonel Silas Ward, Elena's father, watched from the parapet, silver mustache trembling. He could have ordered Kai shot on sight. He could have dragged his daughter by the hair back behind convent walls. Instead, he turned and walked inside. Some wars are lost quietly, behind a slammed door. When dusk fell again, Kai and Elena did not look back. They crossed the same ridgeline where the juniper once stood and found a patch of earth, raw and soft, fed by last night's storm. There they planted a new sapling, this one a small, stubborn thing rescued from a dry creek bed. Its roots barely clung to the soil, but it would grow because they would water it, feed it, protect it from the fires that had tried to kill the last one. In the months that followed, the tiny schoolhouse rose around that new tree. Elena opened its adobe doors each morning to children from every kind of family. Ranch hands boys, half Comanche girls with braids down their backs, babies whose fathers wore Union blue and mothers who spoke Spanish lullabies. They learned letters in English and stories in Apache, side by side on the same chalkboard. At night, Kai mended fences and hunted rabbits for stew. He never stepped inside the classroom, but the children knew if they read aloud without stammering, he'd be there, standing under the new juniper, listening with a quiet pride that needed no words. Sometimes riders came through with news that more Apache families were being pushed north again, starved out of their canyons. And every time Kai would stand in the schoolhouse doorway, rifle across his chest, and remind the messenger this land would not be touched. Not the tree, not the children, not the promise they guarded. Years later, when strangers asked how they survived it all, Elena would smile and say, "We didn't survive, we planted." Because in the end, that's what love was. Not a perfect house or a fence high enough to keep sorrow out. It was a tree that grew from ashes, watered by two scarred souls brave enough to stand in the open, roots deep enough to remember, branches strong enough to shelter what came next. Some people say old trees remember things we're too quick to bury. The promises, the wounds, the courage to stand together when the world wants you divided. Elena and Kai's story isn't just about a frontier promise. It's about what any of us can do when the world says stay divided. Maybe you don't bury a carved box under a desert tree today, but you can keep a promise when it's hard. You can choose to listen when fear says, stay silent. Look around. Our towns, our neighborhoods, our families. They're still full of fences we build out of fear and pride. But what if we remembered that roots run deeper than any fence line? That every time we choose to love across lines, color, creed, family feud, we plant a tree someone else might rest under long after we're gone. Some folks might say Kai should have run, that Elena should have obeyed, but they stood up for each other when the price was everything. And maybe that's the real question for us now. Who would you stand beside even if the world told you not to? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments, what promise would you keep no matter how hard it gets? Do you think love like that still survives in today's world? Thank you for spending your precious time with this story. If it stirred something in you, please tap like, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to remember. Some roots are stronger than fear. Until next time, keep planting, keep loving, and keep your promises wild.